For decades, country music fans thought George Jones and Tammy Wynette were a marriage made in honky-tonk heaven. Together, they created immortal tunes about heartache and loyalty that reverberated through dusty jukeboxes and crowded arenas. The narrative behind the harmonies and public devotion, however, was quite different. Georgette Jones, their daughter, held the narrative like it was a secret too big to share, until now. Georgette was more than simply the result of a well-known love affair. She was also a witness. The daughter was made to grin for photos as her parents hardly interacted backstage. For years, she stayed silent, out of devotion to her mother, out of dread of betraying the supporters, and perhaps, just maybe, with the dim hope that her father might one day become the man his lyrics made him out to be. But quiet was never nice. It was about survival. Georgette Jones has now finished sustaining the myth, well than 30 years after her mother died and a decade after George died. She's speaking the truth, and it's not pretty. This is not a takedown. It's not vengeance. It's something more haunting. The narrative of a little girl growing up in the shadow of legends, discovering that sometimes the most severe wounds come not from strangers, but from the ones the world expects you to love. When the spotlight fades, what remains is not necessarily applause. Sometimes there is quiet. Georgette has finally found her voice. In the early 1970s, George Jones and Tammy Wynette were not only stars, but royalty. The king and queen of country music, the mag stated. Fans loved their chemistry. Their duets grossed millions. While the cameras recorded stolen kisses and shared mics, the reality at home was very different. From the outside, their marriage appeared to be a fairy tale, complete with steel guitars and southern charm. However, to a young Georgette Jones, their love was more like a tornado with a beautiful soundtrack. She recalls tiptoeing about a house where the noise was constantly too high, raised voices, slammed doors, and extended silences. When reporters approached, she was instructed to grin. When George and Tammy walked the stage, she was dressed in her Sunday best and told to applaud whenever the music stopped. Behind closed doors, her mother frequently grieved in the toilet while her father disappeared for days at a time. Georgette was able to distinguish between genuine devotion and acting as a youngster. She noticed how the warmth between her parents dissipated as soon as the red light on the webcam went out. At school, students asked her what it was like to have famous parents. She didn't have the courage to tell them the truth. She had a well-known mother and a father who came and went like a shadow. The stillness in her house did not stem from serenity. It stemmed from fear. There's also some misunderstanding, because how could someone sing so sweetly about love but be so incapable of giving it? Georgette can't recall when she stopped thinking of George Jones as her father and began thinking of him as the storm. She does, however, recall the signals: a smashed coffee table, a broken window. Tammy's hands shook as she lit a cigarette in the kitchen, attempting to conceal the fresh bruise beneath her makeup. George Jones was not only a tortured talent, but also a volatile individual. The same intensity that made him a star on stage became toxic at home. He struggled with alcoholism, drug addiction, and violent outbursts that left permanent impressions, not only on furniture, but also on memory. Georgette frequently heard her mother on the phone, her voice shaking, promising to talk later, attempting to put out the fire before it reached their home. Tammy Wynette, despite her renown and power, was locked in a cycle of mental turmoil. George was sorry and kind one day, yet drunk and vicious the next. Georgette recalls remembering being instructed to pack her luggage fast because Daddy's mad again. They stayed at a motel that night. She was 7. What is the most difficult part? Nobody really spoke about it. Not the label, not the press, not those who worked closest to them. There was an unspoken rule in country music: keep the myth alive at whatever cost. As a result, George's aggression was presented as inner demons, and Tammy's grief became yet another heartbreaking love ballad for audiences to cry over. But Georgette witnessed everything, and every time her mother cringed at a loud noise, every time George walked into a room reeking of liquor and sorrow, her loathing grew, not just from fury, but because she knew her mother deserved more, and nobody would say it. So eventually she will. After their divorce, George Jones and Tammy Wynette continued to sing together, which perplexed Georgette more than their disputes had before. Duets, tours, public appearances. It seemed as though nothing had ever gone wrong. For the industry, it was a fantastic commercial decision. Georgette had emotional whiplash. She was required to smile during picture shoots in which her parents appeared to be close. They were expected to sit silently at award events and receive acclaim for their unbreakable bond. But Georgette knew better. She knew the automobile journeys home were quiet. She knew the backstage dressing rooms were at different ends of the building. And she recognized the man harmonizing with her mother as the same one who had yelled at her in a corridor for embracing Tammy too tightly after a performance. It was perplexing, distressing, and profoundly unjust. Georgette adored her mom. She also desperately desired for her father's acceptance. But how do you love someone who isn't actually present, who just turns up for the applause? She began to feel like a pawn, being used to sell an image and pulled into a narrative she did not believe in. At school, she was told she was fortunate. Fans inquired about what it was like growing up in a music-filled household. She couldn't express the anguish she felt every time George held the microphone instead of her hand. In many respects, her parents' ongoing performances were more difficult than their disagreements, because at least the shouting had been genuine. What about the duos? These were just falsehoods sung in perfect harmony. Georgette, as she grew older, attempted to live her parents' heritage rather than simply carrying it. She began singing, writing, touring. Despite Tammy's gentle prodding, George remained mute, always quiet. There were no congratulatory calls following her debut single. No advice before her debut performance, no voicemails, no letters. She hardly said good luck before opening for prominent country performers. And it wasn't because George was distracted or preoccupied. He had time for interviews. It's time for new wives. It was time for tribute albums and public confessions about Tammy, long after their love had perished. However, he had no time for his daughter. Georgette recalls seeing a television interview in the early 2000s where George was asked about his legacy. He talked highly of his tunes. He even mentioned Tammy. But when asked about his family, he omitted her name. She was a ghost in his narrative. That was the heartbreak. Not the violence or the mayhem, but the neglect. She didn't resent him for what he did as a husband. She despised him for what he failed to accomplish as a father. Because, despite the devastation, a part of her still waited. I hoped he'd reach out, that maybe just once he'd express his pride. But the phone didn't ring. And over time, silence became its own form of abuse. Not too loud, not violent, just a gradual loss of hope. Georgette's wound never healed completely. Tammy Wynette's health deteriorated as she approached her death. Chronic pain, complications of operations, a physique worn down not just by aging, but also by years of mental stress and public observation. Georgette was there for everything: doctor appointments, late-night phone calls, and times when her mother couldn't stand on her own. However, one individual was glaringly absent: George Jones. Despite the years they'd spent performing together, and even after the divorce, George rarely paid them a visit. He did not call to check in, didn't offer assistance. Georgette saw her mother quietly yearn for even the tiniest gesture. It never arrived. Nonetheless, when Tammy died in 1998, something remarkable occurred. George openly lamented. He conducted interviews, lauded her legacy, and even taped moving tributes. The country music world believed George had lost the love of his life. Fans wept. Headlines idealized their relationship. Together again in heaven, they announced. But Georgette felt ill, because the same man who had scarcely talked to Tammy in her dying months suddenly portrayed himself as her mourning soulmate. He didn't mention Tammy's evenings of crying alone. He didn't disclose how long he ignored their daughter. He just put on his cowboy hat, stepped into the spotlight, and rewrote history. That was the last straw. Not the missed birthdays, not those furious outbursts, not even the stillness. It was a lie. The falsehood that George loved Tammy more than he wounded her. The falsehood that he had been present when it counted. And for Georgette, seeing that performance was worse than any fight they'd ever had, because it demonstrated that, even in death, George Jones continued to play a role. Georgette Jones, in her 20s, sat down at the kitchen table one rainy afternoon and started typing. There was no press release, no music playing in the background, just the clack of keys and the weight of 30 years crushing against her chest. She was writing to her father, "Do not beg for anything, not even to seek an apology, but to finally express what no one else had dared to utter." The letter was raw, unfiltered, and unpleasant. She explained how his absence had shaped her, how his quiet had been more powerful than any argument, how perplexing it had been to see him celebrated as a country music star while she was dealing with the repercussions of his inadequacies as a father. She reminded him of missed birthdays, songs he had never heard her perform, and how Tammy Wynette had borne the emotional burden long after their marriage had ended. But she never mailed the letter. She folded it nicely and placed it in a drawer. For years, it remained there, yellowing with age, a mute reminder of a love that never mended. Georgette did not read the letter aloud until decades later, during an interview for her memoir. Her voice crackled. The room went quiet. Because even after George Jones had died away, that letter remained important. It was not intended to provide closure, but rather to reveal the reality. Georgette wasn't simply facing her father when she said it out. She was reclaiming her voice. For every girl who has been asked to be silent, for every youngster buried by their parents' myth, George Jones never offered Georgette Jones the one thing she most needed: recognition. No letter, no late-night phone calls. There is no trembling voice expressing remorse. He died a legend, adored by both presidents and singers, with a musical legacy that left little space for accountability. However, Georgette stopped waiting. Healing, she discovered, does not always come with an apology. Sometimes it comes from finally stating the truth, on your terms, in your own words. She did not speak out to tarnish her father's reputation. She set out because quiet had already taken too much. Her childhood, her confidence, her opportunity to feel noticed by the guy who helped shape her. Georgette not only exposed the flaws in a country music narrative, but she also altered the finale, one in which the daughter no longer buys into the fantasy, one in which the lady becomes the narrator, and where the affection she previously sought from her father has been replaced with the comfort of her own honesty. Georgette now stands by her parents' memories, with clear eyes, an open heart, and a narrative of her own. A narrative about growing up with someone who never truly loved you, and how you climb anyway. Because not all country songs end with reconciliation. Some end in truth, and that can be the most powerful finale of all.